Hello friends, my name is Lily and today I'm going to be showing you how I made this doll-sized tapestry for the animals of Hazel Village. I had Arthur Lamb and Lucas Rabbit helping me out with this craft since it was really their idea, but I'm going to show you each of the steps in this video, and you can also follow the blog post linked in the description, which has the pattern and has links to nice little teaching videos for each of the embroidery stitches. In case you're not familiar, if you want to take a look at those closer, there you have it as a resource. The first thing I'm doing here is folding over the top of the felt banner and pinning it in place. So if you have any sewing pins, which are a very handy thing to own if you're a crafter, you can use those to pin that channel in place. Or if you have even a spare needle, that could be super helpful too, or a safety pin, anything like that. And then I'm using a single strand of embroidery floss in the color that matches the banner and just sewing a back stitch straight across to secure that channel. Next, I'm going to place each piece of the lodge on top of the banner so that I am sure that I like where it's oriented. I put mine pretty central, but you could also embellish this craft with a lot of extra little details if you want. You could sew wildflowers around it, something like that. So you might want to place yours differently. But I'm just pinning the white rectangle there that's going to be the main part of the lodge right into the center. And I'm threading my needle again with a single strand of matching floss, so white this time. And the stitch that I'm going to use to sew pretty much all the pieces in this craft is called the blanket stitch applique style. Blanket stitch on applique, I believe, if you're French, which I'm not. But it's basically the same as a regular blanket stitch if you're familiar with that, but it's just a little bit different, and it's very handy for sewing patches on top of things, basically sewing anything like this where you're not making a border, but you have two tiers of fabric. And again, there's going to be a link in the blog post with a more professional and close-up tutorial of this stitch if you can't see it very clearly in this video. But I'm just going to sew all the way around this white rectangle. I actually didn't sew the very top part because it was going to be covered up with the roof. But you just want to secure it at least on the sides and on the bottom with this applique blanket stitch. As I finished up sewing this first piece, I tied off my thread on the bottom so that the knot would be hidden. And then I just repeated the same step with the roof. When you put the roof on top, you want to make sure that it overlaps a little bit. So the very bottom of that red rectangle should be just slightly overlapping with the very top of the white rectangle. And then again, using just a single strand of matching embroidery floss, so mine was in this kind of terracotta color, I sewed all the way around the roof with the applique blanket stitch. And then I took the little door piece, the little brown half circle here, and again sewed it on with an applique blanket stitch, which while I was doing it, I was thinking about how it kind of looks like half a cookie. I think something about how the stitches look around the edges, that's just like all that I could think about. That's my insight that you get from this voiceover. But anyway, so I sewed the door on, and then I took 2 strands of floss and sewed a vertical line up from the bottom, which splits it and makes it look like 2 doors. And then again with 2 strands of floss, I sewed a French knot on either side of that vertical line to make it look like there are doorknobs. And it's a little tricky to see any of this detail in this lighting, but at the beginning of the video and then again at the end, there's some close-ups so you can see this kind of detail work on the door a little bit better. The next step is to sew the windows. So to do this, I started with the middle window so that placement would be a little bit easier. And the windows are actually slightly rectangular. They might look kind of square, but they're just a little bit squished. So I started by sewing a slightly squished plus sign shape or T shape, where the middle line was just a little bit longer. I should say the horizontal line just a little bit longer than the vertical line. And then I sewed a box around that little plus sign so that each of the ends were covered. And I did that across the whole row so that there were 5 little window shapes. And once I had sewed those, I decided to go back and sew 2 or 3 vertical stitches on either side of either window, right up against the edges, so that it looks a little bit more like they have shutters, which if you look at Jane's original watercolor artwork of the lodge, it has shutters. So I don't know, it doesn't look, it doesn't look exactly like shutters, but I think it adds like a little bit of nice dimension to this little textile version of the lodge. While I'm at it with adding some textural dimension, I decided that the roof could use a little bit something more. I thought it looked a little empty. And again, referencing Jane's watercolor artwork, you can see the roof has some lines running down it. So I decided to take some of that same matching embroidery floss that I used to sew the roof on. And using 2 strands this time, I sewed a bunch of vertical lines down across the whole roof with a stem stitch, which again, if you head to the blog post in the description of this video, I went through and found some nice, helpful video tutorials on all of these embroidery stitches from some wonderful craft guides of the internet. So there is a tutorial that shows you more clearly how to do this stem stitch, but it's really good for anytime you have to do a line in embroidery. So anytime you're working on something with, say, branches or something like that, or stems, hence the name, it's really handy for that. So I just sewed all the way across the roof a bunch of stem stitch lines, evenly spaced apart. And then I tied it off on the back. Now the building is done and I'm just moving on to some extra special little touches. So I'm going to sew the weather vane here on one end. And I used some of this nice kind of goldy green brassy embroidery floss for this. I believe I used 2 strands here. And I sewed just a short vertical line straight up. I think that's about 1 centimeter tall. And then I sewed a kind of slightly squished X shape right on top of it. I'm just, again, looking right at Jane's painting for this, and she painted this really cute little weather vane that has a leaf on top. So I'm doing a French knot on the tips of each of that X shape. I'm not sure what this is called in a real weather vane. These would be the parts that would indicate north, south, east, and west when it would spin around in the wind to see whether it's, an easterly wind or something like that. So maybe I should do some weather vane research. But anyway, French knot on either end of this little X shape. And then to make the little leaf up top, I'm going to do 6 stitches of what's called a lazy daisy stitch, which is really commonly used to make a simple little flower because it's just a loop that looks kind of like a petal. In this case, I'm using it to look like a leaf. So you can follow the tutorial in our blog for a better look at this, but it's just going to be 1 lazy daisy stitch pointing upwards and then 2 lazy daisy stitches on either side to make this kind of 5 pointed leaf shape on top of the weather vane. Next, I sewed a taller vertical line on the opposite end of the roof with a French knot on top, which is the flagpole. Now, if you're familiar at all with Hazel Village lore, you will understand that the flags on top of the lodge are managed by one particular villager, which is Oliver Mouse. Oliver Mouse is a villager who really likes to be busy. He has a lot of jobs, a lot of formal capacities, which he takes on simply because he really wants to do them. One of which is flying the flags on top of the lodge every day, most specifically the weather flag. You can see in Jane's painting, there's a flag that has sunshine on it, indicating that that was a sunny day. Oliver does his meteorological research, I believe in the early mornings. I don't know, maybe he does it the night before, but he always looks into what the day's weather is going to be, and then early in the morning he'll hoist up that day's weather flag on top of the lodge so that the other animals, you know, can be informed as they go about their business, what weather they can expect. We're not sure what the other three flags represent color-wise. There's a blue one and an orange one and a little red one. So those ones are a little bit more of a mystery, but I am certain that Oliver puts them there for a reason, so maybe we'll find out someday. To sew these flags, I just sewed a little three-sided rectangle shape and then filled it with straight stitches. Pretty straightforward. You could get fancy if you wanted to and cut little scraps of fabric and then sew them on instead. That would actually be really cool. I didn't do it for this project, but I think if you chose to do that in your tapestry, I would be heartily supportive and impressed. I did try to sew, it's a little tough to see in this video, but I did try to sew a little yellow sun onto the big white flag, which would certainly be easier if you were sewing on top of a scrap of fabric instead of on top of other embroidery floss. So also, you know what? I'm having this idea right in the moment. You could totally like decide to have different weather on your tapestry if you want. Like you could decide that yours was made on a stormy day. Maybe put a lightning bolt on it or something. That would be very cool. Something I'm being faced with as I do the voiceover for this video is that my natural way of holding my project is basically with my finger covering up exactly the spot that the camera needs to see. So I'm going to keep that in mind and do better next time, hopefully, if I can remember. You know, when you're in the habit of doing something a particular way and then you have to adjust for like the view of a camera, it'll take time, but like, look at that. My hand is completely covering the little flag that you need to look at. Sorry about that. At this point, I decided that the tapestry could use a little bit something more, so I decided to cut some flagstones. Again, in Jane's drawing, you can see that there's some stones leading up to the door of the lodge, so I decided to put that on my tapestry. So I just cut 3 little kind of squished circle-y rectangle shapes. They're not exactly circles or rectangles or ovals. They're a little bit irregular, just like stones are. And then for some reason I decided to leave those and do the border first. So now I'm sewing a blanket stitch around the border. I used 3 strands of embroidery floss for this, and I just used a regular blanket stitch, not an applique blanket stitch. Again, a link to a tutorial on that stitch can be found in the blog post. And I sewed all the way around and then across the top where earlier I had just sewed the straight running stitch. I decided to sew across again with the applique blanket stitch just to complete the border. And then I went back to these cobblestones and again used a single strand of gray thread to sew around them with the applique blanket stitch to secure them in place. And finally, I made 2 little tassels to sew on either end here. Again, the tassel making video is linked in the blog post. These are pretty easy to make, and once you can make a tassel or like a pom-pom, you can have such powers to embellish anything you could possibly dream of, so highly encourage it. Once I had finished up these 2 tassels, I sewed them onto each bottom corner of the lodge. And then after that, the last step is just to put your little branch in place in the channel and tie a string, or I used more of that green and gold embroidery floss in a little triangle shape so that you can see how it's going to hang on the wall, and then tie it off and snip the thread and your tapestry is done. If you don't know anything about the Hazel Village Lodge, first of all, highly recommend exploring our blog for more lore from the animals. Let us know, please, if you decide to make this craft. We really love seeing the crafts that people do. It makes me so happy anytime that somebody does a craft from the blog or from one of these videos. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you and your village friends have an absolutely wonderful day.